So, hello folks, welcome back. It is lovely to see you all. I hope you're doing well. Last time on the channel, we looked at levels 1 and 2 of the Christianity Iceberg, and today, as you can see in the title and the thumbnail, we're going to be moving on to level 3. Level 1 and 2 I found were kind of stuff that you most likely already have an understanding of and that you're aware of. And level 3 is a wee bit stranger. There's a little bit more obscure stuff in it, and so I think we're going to have a good fun today. But get ready and let's get underway with Christianity Iceberg level 3. So the first thing that we have up on level 3 of the Christianity Iceberg is Mammon. Now, Mammon is a word that in the Bible simply means money or wealth. And in fact, it's used in Matthew chapter 6, verse 24, whenever Jesus says, you cannot serve God and mammon. So that idea that you can't have God at spot number 1 in your life, and you also can't have money at spot number 1 in your life as well. You have to have one and you have to have the other. Now, of course, having money isn't necessarily a bad thing, but yes, you can't have one or the other. You can't be devoted to one and the other at the same time. However, over time, the word mammon took on a bit of a different meaning. Later writers gave mammon a face, that of a spirit and that of a demon. If you go to John Milton's classic Paradise Lost, Mammon is a fallen angel who is obsessed with earthly treasure, even in heaven. In fact, in medieval tradition, Mammon is assigned to one of the 7 deadly sins, that one being greed. So basically, in summary, in the Bible, it's a warning against wealth as an idol. Later tradition, Mammon kind of takes on this form of, this kind of wealthy creature that consumes you. And then, of course, then it also has that association with being one of the 7 deadly sins. So that is Mammon, summarized for us. Moving then on, the second thing then we have is divine snakes. Whenever Christians and non-Christians think of snakes in a biblical context, most people think of something that is bad. So, for example, in the Garden of Eden, it is Satan who takes the form of a serpent who tempts Adam and Eve, and that causes the fall of humanity. And that is a true association to make, but however, it is not the full, complete picture. In fact, snakes can also be divine. If we go to the story of the Exodus, Moses throws down his staff before Pharaoh, and then it becomes a snake, and that is a symbol of God's power, and basically it's showing that God is behind Moses through what he's about to do in setting God's people, the Israelites, free. Then if we move on a little bit further in the story of Exodus, the Israelites have left Egypt, they're out of slavery in Egypt, and they're in the wilderness. And the Israelites end up getting bitten by snakes. And God tells Moses to make a bronze serpent on a pole. And anyone who looks at this bronze serpent will be healed from it. And so a snake, which is the very thing that is killing them, becomes the very instrument of their healing. And then what is very interesting about this, when we think about divine snakes, we go to the New Testament, we go specifically to the Gospel of John. In John chapter 3, during Jesus' conversation with Nicodemus, Jesus says, just as Moses lifted up the snake, so the Son of Man, he's describing himself here as the Son of Man, so the Son of Man must be lifted up. So what he is doing here is Jesus is comparing his own future crucifixion to this bronze serpent all the way back in Exodus. So the thing that is being lifted up is going to bring about healing in the same way Jesus going to the cross, dying for the sins of the world, is going to bring healing for the world. And also, as if that wasn't enough, Jesus also tells his disciples to be as wise as serpents and as innocent as doves. So the snakes here are being seen as a symbol of wisdom, not deception. So essentially, snakes can be viewed as bad, and we have bad examples of them in the Bible, but they can also be seen as a strong force for good as well. Next up then, we have the 4th man in the fire. So, This story takes place in the book of Daniel, the Old Testament book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 3 specifically. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or if you're a fan of VeggieTales, Shad, Shak, and Benny. They are kind of high up in the kingdom, but the king of the kingdom, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, he commissions this giant golden statue of himself. And he commands everyone who is subject to him in his kingdom to bow down before this great golden statue. Now, Shadrach and Benny refuse to do that. And because of their refusal to do that, King Nebuchadnezzar throws these three men, Shadrach and Benny, into a furnace that is so hot. This is the story of the blazing furnace. Into a furnace that is so hot that it kills the soldiers who pushed them in. And so, bang, Shadrach and Benny are thrown into this furnace. But when King Nebuchadnezzar looks in, he sees something which startles him. He doesn't see one man or two men or three men walking around. In fact, he sees four men walking around completely unharmed, and they come out not even smelling of smoke. And what's interesting is that the king describes the fourth man who was in that fire as like a son of the gods. So the question comes from this: who is this fourth man in the fire? There are two main views behind this. Firstly, one is an angel, so this is a divine messenger who was sent to protect Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and that is consistent with what we see from angel activity in the Old Testament. But then the second main view of what this fourth man, or who this fourth man in the fire was, is that this is what is known as a theophany, which is a fancy word which just means it is an appearance of Jesus before he came into the world in the New Testament. So it's a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus Christ. So it's God the Son being present with his people before the New Testament comes around. And I think I kind of more go with that viewpoint, that it is a theophany, because, the description of it seems to point towards something more than just a regular angel. We can't say for definite which it is, but either way you want to take it, three men are thrown into certain death in the fire, and they come out without even smelling of smoke. And the reason for that is because they were not alone in that fire. So number 4 is the naked boy fleeing Gethsemane. This is one of the stranger episodes in the New Testament. It's able to be found in Mark chapter 14, verses 51 to 52. The story goes like this: Jesus has just been arrested and his disciples have been scattered. And what we read in this story is that as they are leaving the Garden of Gethsemane, we read this line. We read that a young man wearing nothing but a linen cloth was following Jesus. When they being the soldiers, seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. And that is all we get. There is no name, there is no explanation, there is no follow-up, and so we're just left with the question of who was this boy? The main theory is that this is Mark himself. So it's an eyewitness signature, and Mark, who is the author of this gospel, is kind of inserting himself into this story. He was a teenager, most likely at the time, possibly just woken up from sleep, which is why he's wearing a linen nightcloth. And he follows the arrest party at a distance. He is then grabbed, he then wriggles free, and then he runs away. So if it is Mark, it's an interesting detail because he's kind of admitting his own cowardice in this situation. It's not a flattering, kind of great description of him. It's an embarrassing portrayal of who he is, and it could just be that. It could be Mark giving an embarrassing detail about what he did during that night. Well, there are also other theories as well. People think that it could be James, the brother of Jesus. Some people think that it could be an unnamed disciple. Some people think that it can be symbolic, that the naked flight kind of represents the complete abandonment of Jesus. We don't know for certain, but I kind of push away from the idea that it's symbolic or that it's thematic in any way. I think it is a real, genuine person who was there and who also ran away but we just don't know who it is. Who I think we do know the identity of is the beloved apostle. So, who is the beloved apostle? Well, throughout the Gospel of John, there's a disciple that keeps on coming up time and time again, and he is described as the disciple whom Jesus loved. He is at the Last Supper, he is at the cross, he is at the empty tomb. He is a significant character, although he is never named. However, the most likely theory, and I do really believe this, is that this is John himself. This is John who wrote the Gospel of John. He is the beloved apostle. Well, why do I believe this? Well, because John was part of Jesus' inner circle alongside Peter and James, so it was the three of them, and that kind of fits the proximity. In John 21, it says this is the disciple who's bearing witness about these things in reference to the beloved apostle, and who has written these things. It points to the author, it points to him himself. Now, that's why I think it's John, but then there's another question that kind of comes up, and it's this. Isn't it a wee bit egotistical to call yourself the one whom Jesus loved, the disciple whom Jesus loved? Isn't that a kind of cocky description that John has given himself? Well, I don't think it is, because that is not the way John uses it. He's not using it to say, oh, look at me, how special I was. It's more that it's like he's saying it in a way of he can't even believe that Jesus would have loved him. So it's not I was his favorite. It's more like Jesus of all people loved me. The emphasis is on Jesus' love, not on John's status. He defines himself by being loved, not by achievement or rank. And actually, it's quite humble because it points away from John himself towards Jesus. And also, there's another John that is mentioned in the Gospel of John. That is John the Baptist. So what John, the writer of the Gospel, is doing, he's essentially given up his name for John the Baptist. A lot of Johns being thrown around, but that is who most people suspect is the beloved apostle. It is John, the writer of the Gospel of John. While we are still in the Gospels, we're going to move on to our next topic in the iceberg, which is number 6, which is unknown miracles. So, the Gospels record dozens of miracles. We have healings, we have dead people come back alive again, Jesus walking on water, Jesus feeding the 5,000. There is a wide breadth of miracles that are recorded for us. However, if we go back to John's Gospel and go to the end of John's Gospel, John chapter 20 and verse 30 specifically, we read this. It says, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. And then going to John chapter 21, verse 25, it says, were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. So what is the implication here? Well, the implication is that what we have in the gospel accounts is a selection of the miracles that Jesus did. For every miracle we do know, there are others that we don't know. Maybe there are lives that were touched in unnamed villages, moments that nobody wrote down. We don't know that for certain. But what we can get from this is an appreciation for the fact that all that Jesus did do and is still doing can't be contained in any book, no matter how big it really is. Now, stepping away from the Bible, we're going to shift over and start looking at some extra biblical texts. And we're going to begin with our next topic on the iceberg, which is the Watchers. The Watchers are from the book of Enoch. Enoch is an ancient Jewish text that is not in the main selection, the main canon of books that make up the Bible, but they are widely read, they are highly influential. I'm sure like you type in the book of Enoch into YouTube, you get a bunch of different search results that come up. But who the Watchers are is they are angels that are assigned to observe and watch over humanity. So, if you go into the story of the Book of Enoch, the Watchers are led by Samyaza, and 200 of them descended to Earth. They arrived at Mount Hermon. They took human women as wives. They taught humanity forbidden knowledge such as sorcery, weaponry, and the arts of war. Their children go on to be the Nephilim, giant hybrid beings, half angel, half human, who brought chaos and violence. We actually covered the Nephilim in an earlier level, so you can go back and check that out. But then God's response to these Watchers is that archangels are sent to deal with the Watchers and their offspring, and the Watchers are bound up and they are cast into the depths of the earth to remain there until the final judgment. And what is interesting about this is that we seem to have echoes of these Watchers in the Bible. We go to Jude, verse 6, because there's only one chapter in Jude, and it says, "The angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, he has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day." So again, that sounds like a description of the Watchers. If we go to Daniel chapter 4, we read about a watcher being a holy one and how they appear in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And again, that seems to refer to angelic beings of some kind. Now, much of the information that we get about the Watchers comes from this Book of Enoch, not the Bible itself. But there are some glimpses that we can see in the Bible. And what we can see is that the story of the Watchers is one of the most developed angel rebellion stories in ancient religious literature. And what the next topic is on the iceberg is, again, looking more at the leader of the Watchers, that being Samyaza. I hope that's how you pronounce it right. If it's not, do go ahead and correct me. But who is Samyaza? He is the chief of the rebel Watchers in First Enoch. He is the ringleader. He is the one who persuades the others to go along with the descent. He initiates everything: the coming to the earth, the taking of the human wife, the teaching of the forbidden knowledge. His specific role is spells and sorcery, and there is his second in command is Azazel, who is in charge of weapons, cosmetics, and earthly arts. Now again, for this disobedience, Samyaza's punishment is that he is to be bound and cast into the depths of the earth, kept in darkness for 70 generations until the day of judgment, and then he is to be thrown into the fire. But there are some interesting legends that we get about Samyaza. Samyaza and Azazel are, we're told they're hung upside down between heaven and earth. They are suspended up there, and there is, in some traditions, the thought that the constellation Orion is connected to Samyaza. Orion is Samyaza hanging up in the sky, which is a fascinating thought. And it's a striking image in itself. The rebel angel frozen in the night sky. So, all that to say, Samyaza is a very interesting figure. His name doesn't appear in the Bible, but the tradition around him and what we have heard about him kind of fed into this larger thinking about fallen angels, the origins of evil, and divine judgment. While we're thinking about Enoch, we've thought about First Enoch, but we're going to move on now to the next topic of our iceberg, and we are going to be looking at Second Enoch. Second Enoch, known as the Secrets of Enoch, is a late 1st century text, AD. It is a first-person account of Enoch's journey through the 10 levels of heaven. If you've read Dante's Divine Comedy, specifically Dante's Paradiso, it's kind of like a ancient precursor to it. We were kind of getting a visual tour of the cosmos here. And what we see described in this book and what Enoch sees is he sees angels running the mechanics of the universe. So there are storehouses of snow, of rain, of seasons. Enoch sees the workings of creation at a level that no human normally sees. He sees God's throne. He sees the fate of souls, the rewards for the righteous and the punishment for the wicked. And what does he do in response to seeing all this? Well, he writes it down, which is how we get Second Enoch. And he then passes that knowledge on to his children. And the ending of 2nd Enoch is very interesting in itself, because God transforms Enoch into a high-ranking angel, and he is taken, to dwell permanently into the highest heaven. He stops being human and he becomes something more. What's also interesting about 2nd Enoch is that we have a origin story found in it for Melchizedek. Now, Melchizedek is someone who we're going to talk about a little bit more later on, but Melchizedek is a priest king that is found in Genesis. And what is interesting, and what 2nd Enoch describes about Melchizedek, is that Melchizedek was miraculously born into Noah's family line, and to protect Melchizedek from the coming flood, God sent the archangel to take the baby Melchizedek to paradise. He then survives the flood because he's been taken out of it, and then he reappears after the flood as a priest of God. Again, 2nd Enoch is not part of the Bible. It is extra-biblical, is apocryphal in nature, but it's a fascinating read. And what else is an interesting read is the next topic in our iceberg, which is the Acts of John. We're getting really into the apocryphal books today. So, the Acts of John, what are they? They are a 2nd century apocryphal text, and it narrates John the Apostle's missionary journeys and miracles after Jesus' resurrection. Again, it's not in the canon of the Bible. It was rejected by the Second Council of Nicaea in 787. But there are some very interesting things that are present in it. For example, there is what is known as the bed bug miracle. So, John is looking to stay at a place, and there are these beds that are infested with bed bugs. John then politely tells the bugs to leave, and they obediently march out. They wait outside overnight, and then John invites them back in the morning. We also get an interesting story about John at the temple of Artemis. John prays, the altar collapses, idols shatter, and the crowd ends up converting. There's also an account of Drusiana, who is a female disciple who gets raised from the dead. Now again, none of this is scripture, none of this is the Bible, but it is very colourful. And another very colourful book that we can learn about is the next topic in our iceberg. That is the Acts of Peter. So what is the Acts of Peter? It is another 2nd century apocryphal text. Flip me, there's a lot of 2nd century apocryphal texts in this level of the iceberg. But the Acts of Peter are a 2nd century apocryphal text focused in on, as you may guess, Simon Peter. And there are two stories in particular that are most prominently known from the Acts of Peter. One is the story of Peter going up against Simon Magus. If you know your Bible and if you've read the book of Acts, then you will have heard of Simon Magus from Acts chapter 8, where he tried to buy the Holy Spirit. Well, Simon Magus has made his way to Rome, and he is performing magic and gaining followers and claiming divine power and all that. And Peter arrives to confront him. Now, what we have then that follows up is what I would describe as a magical duel. So Simon publicly boasts that he's going to prove himself right by flying. And so he does that. He levitates, apparently by demonic power. Then Peter prays, Simon falls, breaks his legs, and then dies from his injuries. And Peter is vindicated, and the sorcerer is finished. So that's a bit of a wild story. But then, what is interesting from the Acts of Peter is the second story. And it's actually a beloved tradition to do with Christianity. So, it's about Peter's martyrdom. So, Peter is arrested under Nero and he is sentenced to crucifixion. And instead of being crucified the right way up, Peter requests to be crucified upside down. And he does this because he says that he is not worthy to die in the same way that Jesus died. And so that image of Peter being on an inverted cross, it's actually one of the most enduring symbols in Christian tradition, and we find that source right here in the Acts of Peter. And it's so funny because you could ask probably Christians, whole ream of Christians, how did the Apostle Peter die? And they will say he was crucified upside down. You could then ask them, very rightly so, well, where does the Bible say that? And it's like, it's in the Bible somewhere. Well, it's actually not. It's in the Acts of Peter. But it is a fascinating story, even though it is not scripture. Another story that is very interesting, another apocryphal text, is the next topic of the iceberg, and that is the Apocalypse of Abraham, which is a awesome name for a book. It is an ancient Jewish text from the 1st or 2nd century AD, and it expands on Abraham's story. It partly tells the story of Abraham's conversion, and then it also partly gives us a view of the cosmos. So, part 1, we have the conversion. So, Abraham's father, Terah, who is mentioned in the Bible, is an idol maker. Young Abraham then starts to question, how can these carved objects be God? An idol then falls over and breaks. A fire destroys his father's house. And then Abraham concludes that none of this can be God. And then he turns to the one true God. So that is kind of the story of Abraham's conversion as presented in this book. Then the second is we get a cosmic vision. So guided by the angel Yahuel is how I'm going to pronounce it, Abraham ascends through the heavens. He is shown mysteries of creation, the future of his descendants, a glimpse of God's throne. Azazel appears as a demonic being, whatever that means, as an unclean bird trying to interfere with Abraham's sacrifice. He is linked to the serpent in the Garden of Eden. He represents corruption of humanity by evil. Then that angel Yahuel rebukes him. Azazel is doomed, and he will receive the unclean portion of human sin cast into fire. So, again, it's not in the Bible, but what is interesting about it is that we get to see how people back in the day wrestled with the ideas of evil, of idolatry, and also with what they conceived of what their future was going to be. What direction was history leading to? And they did all that through the lens of one of the Bible's most foundational figures. Now, I believe we're on the last topic of our iceberg, which is wonderful. And the last topic on the iceberg is a very interesting one. It is the Witch of Endor. So, first things first, the Witch of Endor, we're not talking about the Ewok planet from Star Wars, although that would be funny. This is still talking about the Bible, but the setup, or I guess the story, takes place in 1 Samuel, and the setup for it we can see in 1 Samuel chapter 28. So Samuel the prophet is dead. God has gone silent and is not responding to the King Saul at the time. Saul is praying, but he's not getting any answers, and that is because Saul has repeatedly disobeyed God and is going after God's servant David, David from David and Goliath and all that stuff. The Philistine army is massing up and getting ready for an assault, and the Philistines are the enemies of God's people, the Israelites, and so Saul is desperate. Saul is so desperate, in fact, that he turns to necromancy. Now, Saul had himself outlawed necromancy in Israel, but now, putting on the disguise, he goes looking for a medium, and he finds one at this place called Endor. So the seance, goes on, and the witch is kind of reluctant. She knows this is forbidden, and the king has enforced it, but Saul persuades her to do it. She agrees to do it, and then to her own visible shock, it actually works. An old man appears. Saul can't see it, but the woman describes who is appearing, and Saul recognizes immediately that it is Samuel. And Samuel gives a message. It's not a good message. He's not happy about being disturbed. He says to Saul that you've disobeyed God and that your kingdom is going to be taken from you, and tomorrow you and your sons will die in battle. Israel's going to fall to the Philistines. And that is what happens. That is how the story goes on. Saul does end up dying alongside his sons. And so, after this very strange story, we're left with a big question. Is it Samuel? Was Samuel really there? Was the Spirit really Samuel? Well, option one is that yes, he was. And God permitted Samuel to return one last time in order to deliver judgment. Option two could be that it was a demonic deception, something that looked and sounded like Samuel, but the text calls this spirit Samuel plainly. His prophecy is also accurate, so I think we have to say that this definitely was Samuel. Now, we need to understand what the text is actually saying. The text is not endorsing necromancy. Let me just point that out. You should not practice necromancy. Definitely not. But what we have here instead of being an endorsement of necromancy is a betrayal of Saul's total collapse. He is so desperate to cling on to something that he turns to what he himself banned. And 1 Chronicles chapter 10 verse 13 actually tells us that Saul died in part because he sought a medium instead of seeking after God. So what we have here is a very strange episode about a man so desperate and a man who's just at the end of his rope reaching for something forbidden, finding it, and then wishing that he hadn't. Well, on that cheery note, we are going to conclude level 3 of the Christianity Iceberg. If you've stuck around this long and watched the full video, then I really do appreciate it. Do let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this. I've just moved house recently, so you can see that maybe the background's different from previous videos and stuff like that, but I'd be very interested for you guys to give any feedback and to give any comments about any topics that you would like me to cover, both in the Bible, outside the Bible, and I will do my best to accommodate that. So all I got to say now is thank you very much for watching, and I will catch you next time, whenever that is. So thank you very much for watching, and peace.